Welcome to Stories Caf. I'm your host for today's gripping mystery. Set in 1936 at the windswept abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, where Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings unravel an impossible murder amidst ancient manuscripts and hidden secrets in a murder of crows at Mont Saint-Michel. Before we dive into the tale, I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop your location in the comments. Pour yourself a warm drink. Let the mist of Mont Saint-Michel wrap you in its ancient enigma. And let's step into the mystery. Chapter 1. The Island of Shadows. The causeway stretched before us like a silver thread across the restless sea, leading to that timeless silhouette that has stirred men's imaginations for a millennium. Mont Saint-Michel rose from the Norman sands, a medieval marvel, its Gothic spires clawing at the October sky as if to breach the heavens themselves. Magnifique, is it not, Hastings? Remarked my friend Hercule Poirot, adjusting his overcoat against a briny breeze. The Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel has seen much history, much beauty, much devotion, and, I suspect, much darkness too. I shifted uneasily in the motorcar's seat, watching the ancient fortress loom larger as our driver navigated the narrow causeway. The tide was ebbing, leaving dark pools of seawater scattered across the sands like mirrors, reflecting the somber afternoon sky. Flocks of ravens circled the abbey's towers, their harsh cries carried on the wind. I must say, Poirot, I ventured, this hardly seems the place for a restful holiday. Rather gloomy, don't you think? Poirot's eyes gleamed with amusement. Mon ami. Sometimes the spirit craves not the sunshine of the Riviera, but the quiet contemplation of ancient stones and the rhythm of the tides. Besides, he added with a faint smile, I have been invited to observe something most the coding of a medieval manuscript of great significance. Our driver, a weathered Breton with hands gnarled from years at sea, glanced at us in his mirror. You gentlemen are here for Professor Blackwood's gathering. Then, he asked in accented English. Strange business, if you ask me. All these learned folk poking about in old books, muttering about curses. The island doesn't take kindly to her secrets being disturbed. Curses, I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Raising an eyebrow. The driver shrugged the old stories. Monsieur, they say the abbey guards its mysteries. Jealously, the crows, they are the island's watchershin too. Many strangers come seeking what should remain hidden. He left the sentence hanging ominously. Poirot made a small sound of interest in what precisely should remain hidden. The Codex Corvus, the driver replied, lowering his voice. The Book of Ravens, they call it medieval manuscript, full of dark tales. Some say it tells of a great betrayal, a scholar's death, and a curse upon those who would steal the work of others. Professor Blackwood and his group, they think they can unlock its secrets. Perhaps they should leave sleeping dogs to lie. We had reached the abbey's outer walls, and our conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a tall, distinguished gentleman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He approached our vehicle with a confident stride of one accustomed to commanding attention. Professor Blackwood, I presume? Poirot inquired as Asu alighted from the motor car. Indeed, Mr. Poirot Edmund. Blackwood, at your service. The professor's handshake was firm, his voice carrying the cultural tones of Cambridge. I cannot tell you how honored we are to have you join our little scholarly gathering. Your reputation precedes you, of course. You are most kind. Professor Poirot replied with a small bow. I confess myself most curious about this Codex Corvus, a manuscript of the medieval period. Nessa, Professor. Blackwood's eyes lit with an enthusiasm. 13th century, we believe. A remarkable document that may revolutionize our understanding of medieval scholarship and other matters. But come, let me introduce you to our little group. He led us through the abbey's ancient gateway, our footsteps hoeing on worn stone. The interior courtyard was shadowed by towering walls, and I felt an involuntary shiver at the Gothic atmosphere. Several figures moved about the cloisters, their voices hushed in the manner of those engaged in scholarly discourse. Dr. Margaret Wynne, Professor Blackwood, announced, indicating a woman of perhaps 40 years with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes. There was something in her expression, a watchfulness, a barely concealed intensity, that immediately caught my attention. Dr. Wynne is our expert in medieval paleography. Her knowledge of manuscript analysis is quite exceptional. Dr. Wynne inclined her head politely. Poirot, Captain Hastings, I've heard much about your methods of investigation, I confess. I find them fascinating. The application of logical analysis to human behavior bears similarities to the decoding of ancient texts. Poirot seemed genuinely intrigued. And what may? I asked Drew Utathis, particular manuscript. Something flickered across Dr. W's features. Pain perhaps, or old anger academic. Interest, MCO Pro. The Codex Corvus may contain references to scholars of my father's generation. I hope to learn more about certain historical events before Poirot could pursue this intriguing response. We were interrupted by the approach of a younger man with dark hair and a bitter expression. His clothes showed signs of wear, and there was something in his manner that suggested barely controlled resentment. Henry Dubois, Professor Blackwood said thou, with noticeably less warmth than he had shown Dr. Wynne. Henry was once my most promising. He has particular expertise in the architectural history of medieval abbeys. Dubois's jaw tightened. Professor, he acknowledged curtly, then turned to us. Miss Poirot, Captain Hastings, I trust you will, Findor. Work here illuminating the word seemed with meaning, and I noticed Dr. Wynne's sharp glance at the young Frenchman. Perverse. Blackwood cleared his throat uncomfortably. And here we have Mr. James Crawford visiting us from America. He continued, indicating a man of middle years with sandy hair and intelligentry eyes. Crawford had the look of someone accustomed to observing rather than being observed. Please aid to meet you, gentlemen, Crawford said in a distinctly American accent. I am something of an amateur historian myself. Opportunity to witness the decoding of such a significant manuscript was too good to pass up. Poirot studied the American with interest. And your particular field of study, Miss Crawford? Oh, this and that. Crawford replied vaguely. I have a general interest in historical mysteries, unsolved academic questions. Sometime Mr. Past has ways of reaching into the present, don't you think? Finally, we were introduced to Brother Augustine, the abbey's keeper of manuscripts, an elderly monk whose palace seemed to hold secrets accumulated over decades of tending ancient books. His greeting was courteous, but reserved, and I sensed he viewed our scholarly gathering with some unease. The brothers have graciously allowed us to work in the scriptorium, Professor Blackwood explained, as he led us deeper into the abbey. The Codex Corvus requires careful handling, and the scriptorium provides ideal conditions for our research. As we entered the ancient chamber, where generations of monks had copied and illuminated manuscripts, I was struck by the weight of history pressing down upon us. Tall windows filtered the afternoon light, casting long shadows across the stone floor. At the center of the room, upon a lectern of dark wood lay an open manuscript, its pages yellowed with age, its illuminate borders glowing with faded golden crimson voila. Professor Blackwood said reverently, the Codex Corvus. Even from a distance, I could see the intricate illustrations that decorated the margins, ravens with spread wings, scholars bent over books, and darker images that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. There was something gunsling about the manuscript, something that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Poirot approached the lectern with its characteristic deliberate movements, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Most remarkable, he murmured, the illuminations, they tell a story, Nespa. Indeed, they do, Dr. Wynne replied, moving to stand beside him. A story of betrayal, theft, and justice. Long delineated, the shadows seemed to deepen as she spoke, and outside the scriptorium windows I could hear the harsh cries of ravens echoing through the twilight. To dawn brings death. I awoke to a sound that chilled my very soul, not the gentle chiming of the abbey bells that had lulled me to sleep, but the frenzied calling of what seemed like 1,000 ravens. The cacophony was defining, rising and falling, in waves of harsh discord that penetrated even the thick stone walls of our guest quarters. Glancing at my pocket watch, I saw that it was barely past dawn. 5 in the morning, the gray October light filtering through the narrow window held that peculiar quality of early morning at the seaside, neither fully dark nor properly bright. I dressed hastily and made my way to Piu's chamber, finding my friend already fully clothed and standing at his window, his face grave with concentration. "Dear Hastings," he murmured without turning around, "listen to those birds. It is most extraordinary, Nesper, in all my years. I have never heard such a disturbance from the creatures of the air. Perhaps it's the weather." I suggested joining him. At window, the wind has picked up considerably since last evening, but even as I spoke, I knew my explanation was inadequate. The ravens were not simply agitated by wind, or whether their cries held something approaching hysteria, as if they had witnessed something that violated the natural order of their ancient domain. "We must investigate," Poirot declared, reaching for his overcoat, when Nature herself protests so vehemently. "Poirot, he pays attention." We made our way through Theabe's corridors, our footsteps echoing hollowly in the pre-dawn stillness. The sound of the ravens grew ever louder as we approached the main courtyard, and when we finally emerged into the open air, the sight that greeted us was both magnificent and terrible. The sky above Mont Saint-Michel was black with birds, hundreds upon hundreds of ravens wheeling and diving around the abbey's highest spire. They formed a dark living cloud against the pale morning sky, their cries rising to an almost deafening crescendo, and there, silhouetted against its Avon maelstrom, was a sight that my blood run cold. A human figure was impaled upon the iron cross that crowned the abbey's tower, spread-eagled against the morning sky like some grotesque scarecrow. From the courtyard below, there could be no doubt that the person was dead. The unnatural positioning of the limbs, the absolute stillness amidst the chaos of the circling ravens, spoke eloquently of mortality's final victory. "Blur," Poirot breathed, his sharp eyes fixed upon the horrible spectacle above. "But this, it is impossible. How could anyone have reached such a height? And why do they arrange the body in such a manner?" Other members of our scholarly party had begun to emerge from their quarters, drawn by the unearthly clamor of the ravens. Dr. Wine appeared, first her dark hair hastily pinned, and her face pale with shock. As followed our gaze upward. "Dear God," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. Is that Professor Blackwood Ori?" Dubois materialized at her side, his bitter expression replaced by one of genuine horror. "It cannot be," he said hoarsely. "How could anyone have climbed to such a place? The spire, it is accessible only to the birds themselves." James Crawford joined our grimace at least. American practicality asserting itself even in the face of such an appalling sight. "We need to get the authorities," he said firmly. "And a doctor, though I fear there's nothing to be done for the poor fellow, brother." Augustine approached from the direction of the chapel, his face creased with distress. "The ravens," he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, they always know when death comes to the island. The old stories speak of such things. The murder of crows, that serves as the abbey's witness and judge. Murder of crows," I repeated, though I suspected I knew the answer. Collective noun for ravens. "Monsieur," the monk explained, his pale eyes never leaving the figure on the spire. "But in the ancient tales of this place, it means something more. The ravens of Mont Saint-Michel are said to gather when justice must be served, when old sons come home to roost." "Superstition," Crawford said dismissively, though his voice lacked conviction. "Brother." Augustine's gaze was steady. "Perhaps, Mr. Crawford, but the Sex Corvus itself speaks of such things. And no," he gestured toward the spire where the dark birds continued their frenzied dance around the impaled figure. "The Cardiac chord," Dr. Wynne repeated slow, her voice strange. "Of course, the positioning of the body, it's exactly like the illumination on page 47. The scholar pierced by the spear of justice, surrounded by the ravens of retribution." Poirot's head snapped toward her with interest. "You remember this illumination?" "Precisely, madame. Yes," she replied, her color heightening. "I made particular study off that page yesterday evening. The imagery was quite striking, Ori. Dubois was nodding, slowly, a look of fascination, replacing his initial horror. She is correct, Miss Poirot. The manuscript depicts just such a scene. A scholar punished for his theft of another's work, elevated high for all to see. Is shame most interesting? Poirot murmured us. Little gray cells, clearly beginning their work. And tell me, was Professor Blackwood aware of this particular illustration? Certainly. Crawford answered. All examined it together yesterday. Blackwood was particularly interested. In that section of the manuscript he stated might hold the key to understanding the entire text. The arrival of the local police interrupted our discussion. Inspector Beaumont of the Norman Constabulary was a sturdy man with graying whiskers and the harried look of one unaccustomed to crimes more complex than smuggling or poaching. He listened to our account with grilling bewilderment, frequently glancing upward at the impossible sight of the body on the spire. But how is such a thing accomplished? He demanded. His English heavily accented the tower. She is more than 50 miles high. There are no ladders, no ropes, no means of ascent. It is as if the man has flown there, like a bird himself, all been placed there by supernatural means, Brother Agatha, quietly earning a sharp look from the inspector. There will be no talk of supernatural intervention, Inspector. Beaumont declared firmly. This is a matter for the police, not for superstition. We must find a rational explanation. Poirot stepped forward with his characteristic small bow. Inspector, permit me to introduce myself. I am Hercule Poirot, and I should be honored to assist in your investigation if you would welcome such aid. The inspections widened with recognition, Miss Poirot. But of course, your reputation is known even here in Normandy. Indeed, I should be most grateful for your assistance. This case, it presents difficulties of the most unusual nature. Professor Poirot agreed. And the first question we must answer is not how the crime was committed, but why it was staged in such a theatrical manner. The positioning of the body, the time of the discovery, the very presence of the ravens, all of this speaks to a mind that wishes to create a specific impression. Dr. Wynne shivered visibly. You think this was planned? That's a man deliberately arranged for Professor Blackwood to be found in this way. I think, madame, that nothing about this crime is as it appears. Poirot replied gravely. The killer, he has gone to considerable trouble to create a puzzle, not merely to commit murder, but to transform it into a statement. And statements they are made for audiences, Inspector. Beaumont was taking notes furiously, but the physical impossibility remains. Monsieur Poirot, even with planning, how does one transport a body to such a height? Poirot said, his eyes twinkling. Despite the grim circumstances that Marv, Inspector, is what we must discover. But first, I suggest we examine the scriptorum and the manuscript itself. I have a feeling that the Codex Corvus will prove most illuminating indeed. As we prepared to return to the abbey proper, I caught sight of something that made me pause. There, barely visible in the shadow, off the great tower's base, were several black feathers scattered on the stone. Not the natural mold of the circle engravings, but feathers that seemed deliberately placed, as if someone had left them as a calling card, or perhaps a warning. The murder of crows continued their aerial dance above us, their harsh cries echoing off the ancient stones like a requiem for the dead scholar who hung silhouetted against the gray. Normansky Chapter 3, Secrets in the Scriptorum. Scriptorum, which had seemed so peacefully scholarly the evening before, held an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension. The morning light streaming through the tall Gothic windows cast long shadows across the stone floor, and the Codex Corvus lay a pin upon its lectern, like an accusatory finger pointing towards secrets yet told revealed. Poirot moved with his characteristic deliberate precision around the ancient chamber, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Inspector Beaumont followed somewhat less gracefully, his heavy boots echoing on the flagstones as he attempted to match my friend's methodical approach to investigation. Now, then, Poirot announced, positioning himself before the assembled group. We must proceed with order and method. Each of you will please to tell Poirot exactly what you observed yesterday evening. And more importantly, what you have noticed about the good Professor Blackwood's state of mind. Dr. Margaret Wynne was the first to step forward, her composed demeanor from the previous evening now showing cracks off strain. She clasped her hands tightly before her, and I noticed a slight tremor in her fingers. Professor Blackwood seemed particularly excited about a passage he'd been studying. She began, her voice carefully controlled. He claimed it might revolutionize our understanding of medieval academic practices. He was quick about it, and this passage, it concerned what precisely? Poirot inquired, head tilted slightly to one side, in that bird-like manner that indicated his fullest attention. Dr. Wynne's composure faltered. For just a moment, it detailed an incident from the 13th century, a scholar accused of stealing another's work. The manuscript describes his punishment in graphic detail. Ah, the very illumination that so closely resembles our poor professor's final situation. Poirot observed, most curious. And did Professor Blackwood express any particular theories about this medieval incident? He believed it might not be merely historical record, she replied slowly. He thought it could be decode. More recent academic disputes. He mentioned something about patterns repeating themselves across the city. Henri Dubois shifted uncomfortably in the shadows near the tall windows. Professor Blackwood had many theories, he said with barely concealed bitterness. Not all of them were sound. Poirot turned his penetrating gaze upon the young Frenchman. You disagreed with his scholarship, M.S. Dubois. I disagreed with his methods, Henry replied sharply. Professor Blackwood had a tendency to appropriate the insights of others. He was not always scrupulous about attribution, Inspector. Beaumont's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting Professor Blackwood was guilty of plagiarism. I am stating it as fact. Henry declared, his restraint finally breaking. My doctoral thesis, my years of research into the architecturals of medieval abbeys. He claimed it as his own work. When he published his book on monastic construction, my career was destroyed, my reputation ruined, all so that Edmund Blackwood could add a laurel to his academic crown. The silence that followed this outburst was profound. Dr. Wynne studied hungry with new interest, while James Crawford maintained his position near the manuscript, his gray eyes watchful and calculating. A serious accusation, Poirot vaudeville, and one that would provide considerable motive for revenge, would it not? HR's face flushed with anger. Are you suggesting that I am C. Poirot? I may have hated the man, but I am not a murderer. Besides, even if I had wished him dead, how could I possibly have placed his body upon that spire? It is physical impossible. Mo Poirot murmured the impossibility. It troubles Poirot greatly, but let us continue. Mr. Crawford, you observed Professor Blackwood yesterday evening. What were your impressions? The American stepped forward with apparent reluctance. Blackwood seemed nervous about something. He admitted he kept checking the manuscript, particularly that page with the illumination. At one point, I saw him making notes in a small notebook, something he seemed anxious to keep private. This notebook. Inspector Beaumont interjected. Have you seen it since? Crawford shook his head. It wasn't among his personnel effects in his chamber, Inspector. You might want to search more thoroughly. Yours eyebrows rose fractionally. You have already examined Professor Blackwood's quarters, Mr. Crawford. How thorough of you. A flush crept up Crawford's neck. I was merely concerned when he didn't appear for our early morning discussion. We had arranged to meet at 6 o'clock to review his findings, and when he failed to appear, you naturally took it upon yourself to investigate. Poirot said smoothly, most public-spirited. Tell me, what else did you discover in his chamber? Crawford's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I noticed it, and I was certain Poirot did as well. Nothing of significance. His bed hadn't been slept in, but that might mean nothing. Some scholars work through the night when they're excited about a discovery. Dr. Wynne looked up sharply. His bed wasn't slept in, but he retired at same time as the rest of us. Shortly after 10 o'clock perhaps, he returned to Thessaloniki for further study, suggested Brother Augustine, who had been listening silently from the doorway. The manuscript has been known to captivate those who study it intensively. There was something in the elderly monk's tone that made me uneasy. You speak as if the manuscript has some sort of power over its readers. Brother Iside, the monk's pale eyes met mine steadily. The CEX Corvus has been in oar-keeping for 7 centuries. Captain Hastings, in that time it has been consulted by many scholars. Some have found wisdom in its pages, others, he paused, meaningfully, others have found only sorrow and obsession, superstitious nonsense. A remitard, but his voice lacked conviction. Poirot approached the lectern, where the manuscript lay open, his hands clasped behind his back. As he studied the illuminate page, Brother Augustine, you mentioned yesterday that this manuscript tells of betrayal and vengeance. Can you elaborate on the specific nature of these medieval events? The monk moved closer, his ancient fingers hovering over the parchment without quite touching it. The manuscript tells of Master Benedict, a scholar of Greek learning, who gathered about him many students. Among them was one Hercule Corvus. Whether this was his true name or merely a sobriquet, Corvus was brilliant but envious, and when Master Benedict completed his Greek work on the nature of divine justice, Corvus stole the manuscript and claimed it as his own, and the punishment Poirot prompted gently. Master Benedict gathered evidence of the theft. When Corvus was exposed, the judgment was swift and dramatic. He was taken to the highest point of the abbey and impaled upon a spear, left for the ravens to witness his shame. The manuscript records that justice, though delayed, will always find its mark. Dr. Wynne had grown very palladier. This recitation, how specific the parallels are, she whispered. Indeed, pirouetted. But tell me, Brother Augustine, in your long years as keeper of this manuscript, have you noticed any alterations to the text, any signs that it has been modified? Monk's expression grew troubled. Yesterday evening, after Professor Blackwood's intensive study, I observed certain discrepancies. Small changes, you understand, a word altered here, a data modified there. Nothing that would be obvious to a casual reader, but to one familiar with every illumination. Someone changed the manuscript, Inspector Beaumont demanded. But why would anyone do such a thing? Poirot straightened his expression, thoughtful, to create a specific narrative, perhaps to establish a pattern that would support a particular interpretation of events. The question becomes, was the manuscript altered to reflect the crime, or was the crime accommodated to reflect the manuscript? James Crawford frowned, suggesting that someone planned this murder specifically to mirror the medieval account. I am suggesting, Crawford, that we are dealing with a mind that thinks in terms of historical precedent and symbolic justice. Our killer is not merely seeking to eliminate Professor Blackwood. They wish to make a statement about academic integrity, about the consequences of intellectual theft. Drive. Wynne's hands were trembling. No, but who among us would have the knowledge to alter a medieval manuscript so skillfully? Such work requires considerable expertise in paleography and medieval Latin. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Each member of our group possessed exactly such expertise, and we all knew it. The scriptorum seemed to grow darker, despite the brightening morning light, shadows gathering in the corners, like accusations waiting to be spoken. Poirot moved to examine the manuscript more closely, his magnifying lists appearing as if by magic from his waistcoat pocket. As he bent over ancient pages, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, scattered among the illuminated borders, were several fresh ink blots, still faintly damp, suggesting that the alterations Brother Augustine had mentioned were made very recent. Lined at chapter for the tide turns. By midday the causeway to Montacho had vanished beneath advancing waters, leaving our little company truly isolated upon the ancientest land. From the abbey's ramparts, I watched the gray Norman sea swallow the narrow road that had brought us here, transforming the fortress once again into the island sanctuary it had been for 1,000 years. Most convenient for our murderer, Poirot observed, joining me at the no one can arrive, and more importantly, no one can depart. We are ASIU, English saying, all in the same boat, though in this case, perhaps, I should say, same island. The advancing tide had brought with it a change in atmosphere among our group. What had begun as scholarly cooperation, was rapidly deteriorating into mutual suspicion and barely concealed accusation. Dr. Wynne had withdrawn to Herchamber, claiming a headache, while Rue Dubois paced the cloisters like a caged animal. Only James Crawford maintained his outward composure, though I noticed that his gray eyes had taken on a watchful quality that suggested considerably in Poirot. I ventured, lowering my voice, "This business of the altered manuscript, surely it points to someone with considerable expertise in medieval texts. May but consider all of our suspects possess exactly such expertise. Is how you say the qualification for admission to this particular gathering." Tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the ancient stone. "No, the alterations tell us not who but one, and the when. It may be most significant indeed." Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the Abbey's lower chambers. Inspector Beaumont's voice raised an excitement echoed through the stone corridors, followed by the sound of running footsteps, hurried toward the disturbance, arriving to find the inspector emerging from a narrow doorway. I had not previously noticed his face flushed with discovery, and his uniform dusty from investigation. "Monsieur Poirot," he called, beckoning us forward. "You must see this. I have found equipment, climbing equipment, hidden in the storage chambers below." The chamber he led us to was clearly used for Abbey maintenance, coils of rope, tools for stone repair, and various implements necessary for the upkeep of an ancient structure, but they're partially concealed behind stacks of lumber. Was a collection of modern mountaineering equipment, steel pitons, gleaming ropes, and a sophisticated pulley system. "Voila!" Poirot murmured, redexamining the gear with interest. "The impossible becomes possible. Someone has prepared most carefully for their ascent to Thespia." Brother Augustine appeared at the chamber entrance, his aged face creased with worry. "These items," he said slowly, "they are not part of the Abbey's equipment. We have no need for such things then. Someone brought them here specifically for this purpose." Inspector Beaumont concluded. "But when and how did they gain access to these storage areas?" "The Abbey is not locked during the day," Brother Augustine explained. "Pilgrims and visitors come and go freely. Anyone familiar with the building could have concealed these items." Herr Crawford had arrived during this exchange, his face showing what appeared to be genuine surprise at the discovery. "Climbing equipment, but surely that would require considerable expertise to use effectively, partly at such a height and in darkness." "An interesting observation," Crawford Poirot said mildly. "You speak as one familiar with such activities." A slight flush colored the American's features. "I've done some climbing in the Rockies. Nothing as technical as this would require, but enough to recognize professional-grade equipment." When I see Henry Dubois appeared next, drawn by our voices, his reaction to the climbing gear was markedly different. His face went pale, and I noticed his hands clenching violently at his sides. Ario observed, "You seem disturbed by this discovery. Perhaps you too have experience with mountaineering." Yes," Ori admitted reluctantly. "During my architectural studies, I spent considerable time examining the construction of cathedral spires and bell towers. One learns to adapt to heights." "How convenient." Druinen's voice came from behind us. She had appeared silently, her earlier indisposition apparently forgotten, it seems. "We have several potential climbers among our group." There was something in her tone, a note of challenge, perhaps or accusation, that made everyone present shift uncomfortably. The discovery of that climbing equipment had transformed theoretical possibility into practical reality, and suddenly the impossibly muter seemed all too achievable. "We must examine this equipment for fingerprints," Inspector Beaumont declared, though his tone suggested he held little hope of useful results. "Naturel mot," Poirot agreed, "but I suspect our killer has been most careful in such matters. Tell me, Inspector, have you had opportunity to examine the spire itself? Surely there must be evidence of how the climbing was accomplished." "Local fire brigade has promised to assist with that investigation," Beaumont replied. "They should arrive with the evening tide, bringing proper equipment to reach the body and examine Thespia." as if summoned by mention of the macabre scene above a fresh cacophony. Arfavens erupted from the direction of the tower through the chamber's narrow window. I could see the dark birds wheeling once again around the spire, their harsh cries echoing off the stone walls. They have not left their vigil. Brother Augustine observed quietly, Theravants of Montico. They do not abandon their post when death stalks the island most atmospheric. Crawford commented dryly, but hardly helpful for our investigation. It was then that disaster nearly struck again. We were making our way back through the abbey's corridors when a tremendous crash echoed through the building, followed by Dr. Wynne's scream of terror, racing toward the sound we found her pressed against the wall of a narrow passage, her face white with shock. Beneath her feet lay a massive stone block that had clearly fallen from somewhere above. "Dear Poirot," exclaimed, examining the stone, and then looking upward toward the vated ceiling. "Madam, you harmed. Ah, yes," she gasped, her composure thoroughly shattered. "It missed me by inches. If I hadn't stopped to examine that carving on the wall, the stone block was substantially easily large, enough to have killed her had it struck its target." And was already examining the ceiling above, searching for signs of where it might have fallen from. "Most curious," he announced, "there appears to be no obvious place where this stone could have originated. The ceiling is intact, with no visible damage or loose masonry." Poirot was studying the fallen block with his magnifying glass. Hastings regard. "If you please, the edges of the stone, they are not weathered as they would be from centuries of exposure to the elements. This block, it has been recently cut." "You mean someone deliberate teledrad?" "Its eyes, though." The answer seemed obvious. "Precising. And the Timming yacht suggests that Dr. Wynne was specifically targeted. The question becomes, why do Simeon wish her harm? What does she know that makes her dangerous too?" Our killer de Wynne had recovered some of her composure, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I can't imagine why anyone would want to hurt me," she said. "I'm just here to study the manuscript, nothing more." But even as she spoke, I noticed her eyes dart nervously toward the other members of our group, as if she was seeing them with new understanding. Dubois watched her with an expression I couldn't quite read, while Crawford maintained his characteristic. Perhaps Poirot suggested gently, "It would be wise for you to remain in your chamber for the rest of the day, madam, until we understand more about our killer's intentions," as we escorted Dr. Wynne to the safety of the guest quarters. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were moving inextricably toward some predetermined cornice-like pieces on a chessboard, being maneuvered by an unseen hand. The climbing equipment, the near-fatal accident, the altered manuscript, all seemed to be parts of an whose ultimate purpose remained frustratingly unclear. The ravens contend their vigil above, and the tide continued its relentless advance around the abbey's foundations, cutting us a fever more completely from the outside world and the safety it represented. Chapter 5: Illuminated Manuscripts and Dark Truths. Afternoon brought with it a peculiar quality of light, gray and shifting, as if its very air around Mont Saint-Michel conspired to obscure truth rather than reveal it. Poirot had sequestered himself in the scriptorium with the Codex Corvus, his magnifying glass moving methodically across each page while he muttered occasionally in French. Under his breath, I found him there as the abbey bells chimed 3 o'clock, hunched over the manuscript with the intensity of a scholar, or perhaps a detective on the verge of a crucial discovery. "Mon ami," he said without looking up, "you arrive at precisely the right momentum. Observe this most carefully." He indicated a passage near the bottom off the page we had examined earlier, the one depicting the punishment of the thieving scholar. Corvus, under his magnifying glass, I could see that certain words had indeed been altered, though only the most careful examination revealed the deception. "You see here," Poirot pointed with his pencil. The original text spoke of Master Benedict's death occurring in the 20th year of his teaching, but someone has changed his touring the 30th year. A small alteration, Nestispa, but one that changes the interchronology of events. But why would anyone make such a change? I asked, peering more closely at delicate script to create a connection. Hastings to establish a pattern that bridges the medieval past with the present day. Consider if Master had Benedict died 30 years ago instead of 20, the weight of that altered timeline might have reshaped the tangled web of motives and secrets now unraveling before us. But before I could ponder the implications, Dr. Wynne appeared in the doorway of the scriptorium. Her face was pale, yet resolute, defying Poirot's earlier counsel to remain in her chamber. She had clearly resolved to confront the truth head-on. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. It is time I told you the full truth about why I came to Mont Saint-Michel. Poirot straightened, his sharp eyes locking onto her with keen interest. Indeed, madam. And what truth might that be? She stepped closer to the lectern, her hands clasped tightly. My father, Dr. William Wynne, was not merely a scholar of medieval manuscripts. He was Professor Blackwood's mentor, his teacher and collaborator for many years. Her words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples of implication through the hushed scriptorium. I felt the air shift, heavy with revelation. Your father worked with Professor Blackwood? I asked, though her expression already hinted at the painful answer. More than worked with him, she replied, bitterness creeping into her voice. My father uncovered the true significance of the Codex Corvus 20 years ago. He spent years tracing its connections to historical events, revealing a pattern of academic theft and revenge spanning centuries. It was to be his magnum opus, the pinnacle of his life's work. Poirot remained still, his gaze unwavering. And Professor Blackwood stole it, she continued, her voice sharp with suppressed anger. Every insight, every connection, every brilliant deduction my father made Blackwood published as his own. When my father protested, Blackwood wielded his influence within the academic establishment. No one believed the great Edmund Blackwood capable of such blatant plagiarism. And your father? Poirot asked softly. What became of him? Dr. Wynne's composure faltered, tears welling in her eyes. He couldn't bear the shame, seeing his life's work credited to another, watching his reputation crumble under Blackwood's sway. He took his own life rather than endure the humiliation. A profound silence followed, as if the island itself absorbed the weight of her words. Even the ever-present cawing of the ravens seemed to fade. So, you came here seeking what? Madame Poirot asked. Justice, revenge, or merely answers? I wanted to prove my father's research was his own, she said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. I thought if I could show Blackwood didn't truly grasp the manuscript's deeper meanings, that he was merely parroting my father's insights, I could reclaim his legacy. Instead, Poirot observed, you found yourself ensnared in a situation that mirrors the very pattern your father uncovered. Most ironic and most dangerous for you. At that moment, James Crawford stepped into the scriptorium, his usually composed demeanor frayed. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Miss Wynne, he said formally, I owe you an apology and perhaps an explanation. Dr. Wynne turned, startled. Mr. Crawford, my name is indeed James Crawford, but I'm no mere amateur historian. I'm an investigative journalist. I came to Mont Saint-Michel to expose Professor Blackwood's history of plagiarism. He paused, gathering his resolve. Your father's case was not the only one. Blackwood built his career on stealing the work of others. Poirot's eyebrows rose, indeed. And how many such cases have you documented, Monsieur Crawford? At least 6 over the past 25 years. Crawford replied grimly. Brilliant researchers whose work was stolen, their careers ruined, their reputations destroyed. Some, like Dr. Wynne's father, never recovered from the betrayal. Dr. Wynne stared at him, astonishment mingling with her grief. You knew about my father. You knew what Blackwood did to him. It was one of the cases I was investigating, Crawford admitted. I hoped to confront Blackwood here, to force him to admit publicly what he'd done to all those scholars whose work he stole. Henry Dubois chose that moment to join the gathering, his bitter expression suggesting he'd overheard much of the conversation. So, he said with dark satisfaction, "I was not Blackwood's only victim. How comforting to know I had such distinguished company in my misery." Dr. Wynne's voice softened. "I had no idea you, too, suffered at his hands." "Suffered?" Henry laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "He destroyed my life as thoroughly as he did your father's. The difference is, I chose to live with the humiliation rather than escape it." The weight of their collective grievances pressed upon the scriptorium like a storm cloud. Here were three people, each with a compelling reason to despise Professor Blackwood, each with the knowledge and opportunity to orchestrate the elaborate murder that had shaken the abbey. Poirot studied their faces, his mind clearly racing to untangle the threads of motive and means. Brother Augustine appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grave. "Forgive the interruption," he said quietly, "but I felt you should know. I've discovered additional alterations to the manuscript. Changes made, not last evening, but this very afternoon, while we were investigating the climbing equipment. The implications struck us like a thunderclap. Someone had returned to the scriptorium during our absence, continuing their methodical tampering with the ancient text after Professor Blackwood's murder." "What manner of changes?" Poirot demanded, his voice sharp. "Passages concerning justice delayed but not denied," Brother Augustine replied solemnly. "And, most disturbingly, new text that seems to prophesy additional deaths among those who profit from stolen wisdom." Dr. Wynne paled. "Additional deaths? But surely the killer achieved their purpose with Blackwood's murder." "Perhaps," Poirot said thoughtfully, "or perhaps Professor Blackwood was merely the first name on a much longer list." As if in response, the ravens outside erupted into their harsh cries, their voices echoing through the abbey's ancient stones. The Codex Corvus lay open before us, its illuminated pages seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. Somewhere in the shadows of Mont Saint-Michel, a killer continued their dark work, rewriting history and justice to serve their own inscrutable purpose. Chapter 6. Confessions of the Guilty. The storm that had loomed over Mont Saint-Michel all day finally broke as evening descended, unleashing torrents of rain against the abbey's ancient windows. The wind howled through the corridors, carrying the wail of 1,000 restless spirits. We gathered once more in the scriptorium, drawn together by forces beyond our control and secrets that demanded to be laid bare. Poirot stood before us, his presence commanding, like a maestro preparing to conduct a symphony of truth. His eyes moved from face to face, their intensity betraying the furious workings of his mind. The Codex Corvus lay open on the lectern, its gilded pages flickering in the candlelight that supplemented the abbey's dim electric lamps. "Mies, Amos," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the storm's roar. "We have reached a moment where truth must be sifted from deception, where motive must be distinguished from opportunity, and where the guilty must be separated from the merely unfortunate." Henry Dubois shifted in his chair, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like those of a cornered animal. The afternoon's revelations had clearly shaken him, and his features betrayed an inner turmoil. "Monsieur Poirot," he said abruptly, his voice taut with emotion, "I can no longer bear this charade. You speak of guilt and innocence, but I am neither wholly innocent nor wholly guilty." Inspector Beaumont straightened, his attention sharpening. "What do you mean by that, Monsieur Dubois?" Henry rose, pacing before the rain-streaked windows, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I mean that I planned Professor death. For months, I studied this abbey, every passage, every hidden stair, every architectural quirk. I brought the climbing equipment here, piece by piece, over several visits, concealing it in the storage chambers below." Dr. Wynne gasped, while Crawford's expression remained guarded. Brother Augustine crossed himself silently. "You are confessing to murder," Beaumont said, his tone heavy with the weight of the accusation. Inspector Beaumont demanded, reaching for his notebook. I am confessing to planning a murder. Henry corrected, his voice growing stronger. But I did not execute that plan. Someone else did so, Moyen, who knew exactly what I intended and used my preparations for their own purposes. Pizarro's eyes gleamed with interest. Most fascinating, continue. If you please. Henry turned away from Thundo, his face haggard but determined. Last night I could not sleep. Thought of finally confronting Blackwood, of making him pay for what he had done to my career. It consumed me. At approximately 2 o'clock this morning, I made my way to the storage chambers to retrieve the climbing equipment, and Poirot prompted gently. It was gone. Henry said simply, all of it, the ropes, the pittance, the pulleys, everything I had so carefully hidden over the past months had vanished. Someone had discovered my cache and taken it for their own use. The silence that followed was broken only by the drumming of rain against stone and the distant cry of ravens sheltering from the storm. Did you see? Does anyone hear anything that might indicate who had taken your equipment? Inspector Blount asked her, shaking his head. Nothing. I searched the Abbey as thoroughly as I dared, but found no trace of the gear. It was as if it had Yet this morning, we discovered the equipment in the very chambers where you claimed to have hidden it. Poirot observed. How do you explain this? Apparent contractee. Someone returned it after using it for the murder. Henry replied, we wanted it to be found. Wanted me to be implicated in Blackwood's death, don't you? See, I've been manipulated from the beginning. My hatred, my knowledge of Theabe, my careful preparations, all of it used by someone else to commit the perfect crime. Dr. Wynne leaned forward, her face pale but intent. Hi, if what you're saying is truth, and the real killer knew about your plans, they must have been watching you, studying your movements. Pooh agreed. The question becomes, who among our little group would have had the opportunity to observe Monsieur Dubois so closely, who could have discovered his preparations and appropriated them for their own use? Crawford cleared his throat and comfortably. I must admit, I had noticed Henry's unusual interest in the abbey. During our previous visits, he spent considerable time examining the tower structure, asking detailed questions about access routes to the upper levels. You were watching me. Henry demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. I was watching everyone, Crawford replied evenly. As an investigative journalist, I've learned to observe behavioral patterns, to notice when people are concealing their true intentions. Your obsession with Blackwood was obvious. Brother Augustine spoke forth, first time since Henry's confession began. I too noticed Monsieur Dubois' frequent examinations of the Abbey structure, but I assumed it was merely scholarly interest in our architectural. How convenient, Dr. Wynne said softly, and there was something in her tone that made everyone turn to look at her. Everyone was watching. Ori, everyone knew of his hatred for Blackwood. Everyone could have anticipated his plans. Poirot studied her with You sound as if you speak from personal knowledge. Madame Dr. Doublecosier began to crack under his penetrating gaze. I simply meant that. Henry's feelings were hardly a secret. We all knew how Blackwood had destroyed his career. Indeed, Poirot murmured. But knowledge and action are two very different things. Tell me, madame, during your own visits to the Abbey, for I suspect this was not your first time here, did you too notice Monsieur Dubois's unusual interest in the architecture? My own visits, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. Don't know what you mean. Come now, madame, a scholar of your expertise does not undertake such an important research project without considerable preliminary investigation. You would have visited Mont Saint-Michel several times to prepare for this gathering, would you not? Dr. W's hands began to tremble. Yes, I made a few preliminary visits to familiarize myself with the Abbey's layout, to speak with Brother Augustino about the manuscript, and during these visits you observed Monsieur Dubois's preparation. Poirot stated rather than ask. You saw him hiding the climbing equipment, studying the tower structure, planning his revenge against Professor Blackwood. Thoughts not. I didn't. She began, then stopped abruptly. As if realizing she had already said too much, Inspector Beaumont was scribbling furiously in his notebook. Are you suggesting that Dr. Wynne knew of Moon Dubois's murder plot in advance? I am suggesting more than that. Poirot replied gravely. I am suggesting that Dr. Wynne not only knew of the plot, but decided to appropriate it for her own purposes. After all, why go to the trouble of planning a murder when someone else has already done the work for you? The storm outside seemed to intensify at that moment. Lightning illuminating the scriptorium in stark theatrical flashes. Dr. Wynne had gone very pale, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. You can't prove any of this, she whispered. You're simply guessing, making wild accusations based on speculation. Perhaps, Poirot acknowledged, but I think we shall find that the evidence supports more than mere speculation. Tell me, madame, what did you do with Professor Blackwood's missing notebook? The one Monsieur Crawford mentioned, the one containing his private thoughts about the manuscript's true significance. Dr. Wynne's eyes darted wildly around the room, seeking escape where none existed. Henry was staring at her with dawning comprehension, while Crawford watched with the cold interest of a journalist scenting the climax of a long investigation. I don't know anything about a notebook, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Brother Augustine had been listening to this exchange with growing distrust. Dr. Wynne, he said gently, if you have knowledge that could help you understand these terrible events, surely it would be better to speak freely. No. But Dr. Wynne remained silent, her face a mask of stubborn defiance, even as tears began to stream down her cheeks. The weight of a cumulative events was pressing down upon her, like the storm pressing down upon the abbey, and yet she held to her denials with the desperate strength of someone who knew thought confession meant not merely acknowledgement of guilt, but the final destruction of everything she had vowed to preserve. Chapter 7: The Murder of Crows. The storm reached its crescendo as Poirot led our small procession through the abbey's winding corridors toward the tower that had witnessed Professor Blackwood's theatrical demise. Lightning illuminated the ancient stones in stark, supernatural flashes, while thunder rolled across Mont Saint-Michel like the voice of divine judgment itself. Poirot announced as we climbed a narrow spiral staircase. The time has come for Poirot to demonstrate how our killer accomplished the impossible, and more importantly, why they chose to do so in such an elaborate manner. Dr. Wynne followed reluctantly, her face pale and drawn in the flickering torchlight. Henry Dubois climbed behind her with the grim fascination of one witnessing the exposure of his own manipulated plans, while Crawford maintained his journalistic composure despite the dramatic circumstances. Inspector Beaumont brought up the rear, his heavy breathing echoing in the confined space as we ascended toward the abbey's highest reaches. The beauty of this crime, Poirot continued, us what's climbed lies not merely in its execution, but in its misdirection. Our killer wished us to focus on the impossibility of the act itself, rather than on the deeper question of motivation and opportunity. We emerged onto a narrow stone platform, perhaps 30 feet below the spire, where Professor Blackwood's body still hung silhouetted against the storm. Lashed sky here, the full force of the wind and rain struck us, and I had to grip the stone parapet to maintain my balance. Observe, if you please, shouted over the howling wind, pointing toward a series of iron rungs set into the tower's outer wall. The abbey's builders, they were practical men. They provided means for maintenance of the spire, though these handholds have not been used for many. Inspector Beaumont examined the ancient rungs with his electric torch, but surely climbing to such a height would require exceptional skill and strength. May no inspector not, when one employs the proper equipment and techniques. Poirot moved to a shadowed alcove where Ori's stolen climbing gear had been concealed after its use. Observe how the ropes have been arranged, a sophisticated pulley system that would allow even a person of moderate strength to hoist both themselves and other cargo to the some-meter wind shrank back against the stone wall as Poirot demonstrated the rope system's mechanics. You're suggesting that Professor Blackwood was already dead when he was placed on the spire, she asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. I am stating it as fact, madam. The positioning of the body, the complete absence of defensive wounds, the theatrical arrangement that's so perfectly merged, the manuscripts, illumination, all of this speaks to careful post-mortem staging rather than murder committed at the scene. Crawford was taking notes, despite the driving rain. But how was Blackwood actually killed? And where? An excellent question, Mr. Crawford, and one that leads us to the heart of our killer's psychology. Poirot turned to face Dr. Wynne directly. Tell us, madame, about your father's study in Oxford, about the room where he spent his final hours before taking his own life. Dr. W.'s composure cracked entirely at this unexpected question. What does that have to do with anything, everything? I fear you see. Hastings Orcular is someone driven, not merely by the desire for revenge, but by the need to create perfect, symbolic justice. Professor Blackwood did not die here on the tower. He died in circumstances that exactly mirrored those of Dr. William Wynne 20 years ago. The implications of this statement sent a chill through our small group. It had nothing to do with the storm raging around us. Henry stared at Dr. Wynne with dawning horror, while Crawford's journalistic detachment finally began. Tokrak, you're saying that Margaret killed Blackwood in the same manner as her father's suicide, Inspector Beaumont demanded. Processimo. The same room, the same method, even the same time of day. Perfect justice as our killer saw it, forcing Blackwood to experience exactly what his theft and betrayal had driven Dr. Wynne to endure. Dr. Wynne was trembling now, whether from cold or emotion. I could not tell, you can't know that, she whispered. Yawarant. There no one was there, but someone was there, madame. You were there. A.O. lured Professor Blackwood to your father's old study at Oxford, a room you have maintained exactly as it was 20 years ago. Have you not a shrine to his memory, and your desire for vengeance lighting, illuminated Dr. Wynne's face in stark relief, revealing an expression of anguish and fury that I involuntarily stepped backward for a moment. The mask of scholarly composure dropped entirely, and I glimpsed the depths of hatred that had sustained her through 2 decades of careful planning. He deserved it, she said suddenly, her voice rising above the storm. He deserved to know what it felt like to face death alone and betrayed just as my father did. Margaret said hoarsely, what have you done? But Dr. Wynne was beyond rational conversation, now caught up in the release of emotions too long suppressed. You want to know how I did? I accomplished the impossible. I'll tell you. She moved toward the edge of the platform with a sudden desperate energy that made Inspector Beaumont reach for his handcuffs. I studied Blackwood for months, learned his habits, his weaknesses, his vanities. I knew he would never resist the opportunity to examine my father's private papers. Papers, I told him, contained evidence that would vindicate his theft of my father's work. So you lured him to Oxford, Poirot. Observed calmly. I drugged his wine with laudanum, the same drug my father used to end his life. When Blackwood realized what was happening, when he understood that he was doing exactly as my father had died, her voice broke with savage satisfaction. The terror in his eyes was everything I had dreamed of. For 20 years, Crawford was scribbling frantically, despite the rain soaking his notebook. But how did you transport Thebedy here? How did you manage the physical aspects of the crime? Dr. Wynne laughed, a sound that sent ice through my veins. Henry provided everything I needed, though he never knew it. I followed him here, watched him hide his equipment, studied his plans for revenge. When the time came, I simply appropriated his preparations for my own purposes. Henry's face had gone ashen. You used me. You let me believe I was planning my own revenge when all along, I was planning something far more elegant than your crude notion of justice. She finished. My father's death required something more sophisticated than simple murder. It required the complete restoration of his reputation and the exposure of Blackwood's pattern of theft. Inspector Beaumont was struggling with his handcuffs in the howling wind. Dr. Wynne, I arrest you for the murder of Professor Edmund Blackwood. But as he spoke, Dr. Wynne took another step toward platform's edge, her eyes wild with a desperate calculation that filled me with sudden terror. The stone parapet was barely waist high, and beyond it lay a drop of more than 200 feet to the abbey's courtyard. "Below Justice," she said, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos around us. "Justice delayed, but not denied. The ravens noted. They've been waiting 20 years for this moment, and indeed, despite their raging storm, I could hear them, the harsh cries of the island's ancient guardians circling endlessly around the tower where their vigil had begun with Professor Blackwood's death, and wouldn't only when the final accounting was complete." Chapter 8. Justice with the Ticket. Standoff on the tower platform lasted only moments, though it felt like an eternity, suspended between lightning and thunder, between confession and consequence. Dr. Wind stood poised at Thustone Parapet's edge, the wild wind whipping her dark hair about her face. As gazed down at the abbey's courtyard far below Margaret, Henry Keller desperately, "This will not bring your father back. This will not restore what was taken from him, won't it?" she replied, her voice eerily calm, despite the chaos of the storm. "The manuscript will tell the true story now. The world will know that Edmund Blackwood built his reputation on stolen brilliance, that my father died for another man's greed." Inspector Beaumont had managed to secure his handcuffs, despite the driving rain, but he dared not approach closer, for fear of precipitating the very tragedy sought to prevent. Dr. Windstep away from the edge. "Whatever you've done, whatever drove you to it, this isn't the answer." Pooh, however, remained remarkably calm, his sharp eyes fixed not on Dr. Wynne, but on something beyond her thick, below where the receding tide was beginning to reveal secrets that had been hidden beneath the Norman waters. "Ah, madame," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the wind with surprising clarity, "but you have made one crucial error in your otherwise perfect plan." Dr. Wynne turned toward him, momentarily distracted from her precarious position. "What do you mean?" "The tide, madame. She is your betrayer. Observe, if you please, what the retreating waters have revealed." We all followed his gesture toward the causeway where the storm's lightning illuminated a sight that made my blood run cold. There, partially buried in the sand and seaweed, exposed by the low tide, was the unmistakable outline of a motor car, not the vehicle that had brought us to Mont Saint-Michel, but another, older automobile that had clearly been concealed beneath the waters for some time. Crawford understood immediately. "The car you used to transport Blackwood's body from Oxford," he said, his journalist's instincts connecting the evidence. "You drove here during high tide and deliberately submerged it, knowing it would be hidden until the waters receded." Dr. DeWinn's face went white as she realized the implications. "That's impossible. I calculated the tides precisely. That car should remain hidden for Disiat." Madame Poirot replied gently, "You calculated based on normal tidal patterns, but you failed to account for the storm, the atmospheric pressure, the wind. They have accelerated the tide's rate by several hours. Your carefully laid plans, they are undone by force beyond your control." Inspector Beaumont was already signaling to the Abbey Bellowith, his electric torch summoning assistance to examine this crucial piece of evidence. "That vehicle will contain forensic proof of the body's transport, won't it? Blood, hair fibers, all the physical evidence needed to confirm your confession. More than that," Henry added with growing realization, "it will prove premeditation, the careful planning, the precise timing. This wasn't a crime or fashion, but a calculated execution." Dr. Wynne seemed to deflate Athos's revelation, the desperate energy that had sustained her through the confrontation draining away like Thetid below. She stepped back from the parapet's edge, her shoulders sagging with the weight of inevitability. 20 years, she whispered, more to herself than to us. 20 years. I planned this moment, and it's undone. Byweather and Water Brother Augustine, who had remained silent throughout the dramatic confrontation, finally spoke. "Dr. Wynne, your father was a good man, a brilliant scholar, who deserved better than the betrayal he suffered, but surely he would not have wanted his memory preserved through such violence. You didn't know him," she replied bitterly. "You didn't see what Blackwood's theft did to him, the despair, the Smith's slow destruction of everything he believed in. Justice isn't always gentle, brother. Sometimes it requires blood." "Perhaps," Poirot interjected, But justice without wisdom becomes merely vengeance, and vengeance, as the Codex Corvus itself demonstrates, has a way of consuming those who pursue it as if summoned by his words. The storm began to abate, the lightning growing more distant and the thunder fading to a distant rumble. Through the clearing air we could hear the harsh cries of the ravens as they settled back into their ancient vigil around the abbey's towers. Crawford was still taking notes, his journalist's mind already composing the story that would expose not just Dr. W's crime, but the entire pattern of academic theft that had precipitated it. The world will know the truth about Blackwood plagiarism, he said firmly. Your father's work will be properly attributed his reputation. Restored, will it? Dr. Wynne asked with bitter irony, or will this become simply another sordeddle of murder and revenge obscuring the very injustices it was meant to eliminate? Inspector Beaumont approached carefully, the handcuffs ready. Dumagere. Wynne, I arrest you for the murder of Professor Edmund Blackwood. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. She offered no resistance as the handcuffs clicked into place, her fight finally exhausted. There's something else you showed. No, she said as Beaumont led her toward the staircase. Professor Blackwood wasn't the only one. Crawford was right. There were others victims across the decades. I have documentation evidence of at least 8 cases of blatant plagiarism. Where is this evidence? Poirot inquired. Hidden in my father's study, the same room where Blackwood did everything. Is there letters, documents, proof of career, built on Sippomatictive? She paused, looking back at the manuscript, visible through the scripture. The CEX Corvus will tell its story. Now the true story of how Theravans of justice finally came home to roost as we made our way down the narrow spiral staircase. I reflected on the events that had transformed our scholarly retreat into a theater of revenge and revelation. The storm was clearing, and through the abbey's windows, I could see the causeway beginning to emerge from the retreating waters connecting Mont Saint-Michel once again to the world beyond its ancient walls. By morning, the authorities would examine the submerged motorcar and find the evidence that would seal Dr. Wynne's fate. Henry Dubois would return to France, carrying the knowledge that his thirst for revenge had been manipulated and exploited, while James Crawford would write the story that would finally expose Edmund Blackwood's systematic plagiarism and restore the reputations of his many victims. The CEX Corvus would return to its place in the abbey's collection, its recent alteration serving as a reminder that the medieval tales of justice and betrayal it contained were not merely historical curiosities, eternal patterns that continue to play out across the centuries. The manuscript had been used as both weapon and confession, its illuminated pages bearing witness to crimes both ancient and modern. As we reached the abbey's main level, I caught sight of Brother Alston, carefully closing the ancient tome, his weathered hands gentle as headed the final page. The ravens outside had grown quiet. At last, their vigil ended with the restoration of justice to Mont Saint-Michel, the murder of crows that had gathered towardness. Professor Blackwood's theatrical demise was dispersing into the clearing night, returning to their eternal watchover. The island's secrets, the tide would turn again as it had for 1,000 years, but the truth would remain exposed on the causeway of time, undeniable and permanent as the ancient stones of Mont Saint-Michel itself. Thanks for joining us for a murder of crows at Mont Saint-Michel. Did you suspect Dr. Margaret Wynne before Poirot revealed how she manipulated Ari's revenge plot for her own elaboration? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this atmospheric adventure with Poirot, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember, Poirot's wisdom, the little gray cells reveal fate. Vengeance disguised as justice can corrupt even the most noble intentions, and that ancient stones may witness modern sins, but time and tide ultimately expose all truths.